There we go. Yeah, so we're going to pick up from where we left off. If you have that handout from last week, we're on page number 2, and we were talking about the fact that Abraham is a very, very significant Old Testament figure. Um, and in particular, we're in a New Testament era. The Bible indicates that we are heirs to Abraham and descendants spiritually of Abraham. And so we say, okay, well, maybe we should really look closely at Abraham to see what we can apply to our lives and to our walk with God. Um, so we were on page 2, and we looked at a couple of things already. The fact that Abraham, as opposed to Enoch and as opposed to Noah, Abraham was called of God to come out of a lifestyle, but he's left to live in and among the world of sin. And we find that as the people of God in today's age, God doesn't give us a life that's removed from the ungodly world. We live in and among, but we are to be of a different world and of a different kingdom, not of the kingdom of this world. So we see that as a way that we can kind of look to Abraham for an example in doing that. And we saw that Abraham has a covenant with God, and that God gave him covenant promises, and that we're the inheritors of those promises, but that he also gave him a covenant sign. And Abraham had a part to get into that covenant. You know, like if we have a legal contract, you can agree on everything, but you got to sign on the dotted line or it's not going to be binding. And in Abraham's case, there was a particular sign to make that covenant totally official. It's for real. It's not just talk anymore. And that's the way it is with us. And we talked about that sign previously. Now we're up to this last little box here on the bottom of page 2. And let me pull up the slide. And we see in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, the Bible says that Abraham believed God, and God counted that to Abraham for righteousness. And we know this is a really significant aspect of what is in the story of Abraham, because when the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Romans, he referred back to this exact verse. Basically, he's doing a Bible study with the Romans by writing it out. And he refers back to Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, when he's writing Romans chapter 4. And he says, "What saith the scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness." That's a powerful lesson to understand how we're going to walk with God and how our access to God becomes available. Because the covenant that Abraham had with God was unique. God did not make that covenant with everyone on earth at that time. He made that covenant with Abraham. And he said, this covenant is with you and with your descendants. Well, I don't think, as far as I know, that I'm a blood descendant of Abraham. And so based on the establishment of that covenant, I wouldn't have access to that covenant. But continuing on in Romans chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says in verse 11, talking about Abraham, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised. They don't even have to have that Old Testament sign of the covenant. It's believing that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. And then skipping down to verse 16, in the same conversation and the same Bible study, Paul said, therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end or to the purpose or with the intention that the promise might be sure or secure to all the seed, all of Abraham's descendants, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. And this scripture, the principle that the Apostle Paul is describing here, is the reason why Abraham is sometimes referred to as the father of the faithful, because the Apostle Paul taught us that if we have faith and we believe the same way that Abraham did, that connects us to Abraham spiritually, and we become the children of Abraham. You know, prior to the New Testament age, a person who was not a blood descendant of Abraham and of Jewish descent could also enter into the covenant, but they had to go in through Abraham's sign, the sign of circumcision, and then other rituals and things that were required of them to enter into that. But the Apostle Paul is teaching us that since Jesus came, Jesus destroyed the division there, but it didn't mean that all of a sudden just everybody's just in. We have to come in by believing, not by circumcision, not by the law, but through faith. Now, I want us to look kind of closely at what this means. What does it mean to believe? And what does it mean to have faith? And so I just kind of pulled together a bunch of scriptures that talk about believing. We can just kind of look at several things that the Bible has to say about it. And, you know, you could study believing and study faith, what the Bible teaches, for weeks and weeks and weeks. But we are going to take a little bit of time to look at some of what it has to say here. So here's John chapter 12, and this is talking about Jesus and then the masses, in particularly the established Jewish population. And Jesus had done all sorts of miracles. And verse 37 says, but though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him, that the saying of Esaias the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? Which, by the way, just a side note, in case you're not aware, in the New Testament, the name Esaias is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Isaiah. So when he talks about Esaias, it's actually talking about Isaiah. So what we see here is that seeing miracles does not necessarily result in faith. God does work miracles. I've seen it. I know it. The Bible promises it, and it's for us today. And when we seek God for a situation, we should seek him for the supernatural, for the miraculous. But the Bible says that signs, like miracles, follow them that believe. The believing doesn't follow the sign. The miracle doesn't bring about the faith. That doesn't seem to make sense, right? It would seem like if you see a miracle, well, now I can believe. And, you know, sometimes probably all of us, I would imagine at least most of us, have probably at some point in your life struggled with your faith and thought or even prayed, God, if I could see a miracle, I would believe. Somebody here has thought that very specifically. And you've thought, if you would just let me see a miracle, then I could put away this doubt, and I could just believe you from here on out. But the Bible lets us know it really doesn't actually work that way. And God might have let you see a miracle when you were in that state, just to give you some relief and some help. But it's also possible, if you look back on that time in your life, maybe you didn't see a miracle at that time. If that's the case, that's the design of God, knowing what you really need for faith. And it's not necessarily to see miracles. We start from a place of faith, and then we seek God for miracles, and we seek God for his intervention. But we don't seek miracles so that we can believe. It just does not work. Jesus told a parable of a guy a beggar who died, and then also a rich man who owned the house outside of which the beggar used to beg. He also died. Well, the rich man was lost because he had not served God. He only served his money. And the Bible describes that he was in torment after dying because he was lost. and he saw Abraham across the gulf up in paradise. And he said to Abraham, I've got brothers and I don't want them to come to this place, but they're lost too. So would you send that beggar named Lazarus to rise from the dead and go and tell them and warn them about this place? And Abraham said, they already have the Bible. The phrase he used was, they have the law and the prophets. He said, let them hear that. And the rich man said, well, I know they have that and they know about it, but they don't believe it. I already know. They've heard it, but they don't believe it. But if a guy rose from the dead and went and talked to them, then they would believe. That's what they need. They need this miracle sign. But Abraham knew better than that. And Abraham said to the rich man, if they don't believe the Bible, then they will not believe, even if somebody is raised from the dead. So the faith has to come first. And if we will put our faith in God, we will see his provision. We will see him go beyond what we are capable of. And we will see him take care of us. So these people in Jesus' day, even though they had seen miracles, they didn't believe. Hold on just a minute. I want to skip that one and let's take a look at this one. Now, look at what the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Romans chapter 9, talking about the nation of Israel. He said, Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, they had a rigid set of rules given to them by God. The rules were not wrong, but they were so focused on proving their own righteousness by following that law that it ended up they couldn't attain to it. Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Verse 32. Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone of just trying to be good enough, trying to be righteous, trying to do everything the law said to gain, to earn salvation for themselves. And that was a stumbling stone that they stumbled at. And so he said they need to seek it by faith, seek salvation by faith, and seek righteousness by faith, not by willpower. Seek righteousness by faith. Building on that concept, the same Apostle Paul wrote the book of Galatians, and he said in chapter 2, verse 16, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. And the Apostle Paul was a man who had grown up living very, very strictly by the law. And so he's looking back on his life experience saying, you know what? It doesn't work. There's no success in trying to do it by your own strength, by your own inner moral fiber, by your own willpower. I can't do everything right on my own. And so he's conveying to us, we've got to come to God. Yes, we do need to be righteous. Yes, we do need to live righteously, but we've got to come to God for that. And we've got to access that and get it manifested in our lives by faith, by approaching God by faith, not approaching God to say, hey, God, let's make a deal here. I've lived really good, so now you bless me. No, but coming to God just with a faith in God and with a faith in what God has said and promised. I'm going to skip the next one, kind of makes the same point, and let's go here. But this is interesting because this same Apostle Paul wrote the book of Titus. And in chapter 3, verse 8, he said, this is a faithful saying, and these things I will that thou affirm constantly, that they which have believed in God might be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable unto men. So he's kind of pulling it back the other way. We just read where he taught, look, you can't succeed by works of righteousness. You cannot earn your salvation. You can't make yourself righteous by following the law. But he does say to Titus that I want you to, Titus was a young preacher, by the way, who the Apostle Paul mentored. And so he's writing to Titus to help Titus develop his ministry and what Titus should then turn around and convey to the people under his influence. And he said, listen, don't, it's not about telling them to forget about doing good works. You need to affirm constantly that they need to be careful to maintain good works. Be careful about it. Care about it. Give it some effort. Give it attention. You need to do good works. You should do good works. But that's those that have believed in God. It starts with the believing. It starts with the faith. And if you come to God with faith, then you need to be careful to maintain good works. Excuse me. The greatest and most thorough teaching on this, because it can get confusing and you can really get out of balance with how you're trying to seek after and how you're trying to apply faith and works. And you can get out of balance with rules in your life, and that you're just so focused on making sure you do right that if you ever mess up, it separates you from God, and you can't humble yourself to come to God because you've committed so hard to living by a set of rules, and that's called legalism. But then you can also be out of balance the other way, where you say, you know what, I'm an unrighteous by nature, and I just can't be righteous. The Bible tells me that I can't earn righteousness. I can't earn salvation. I can't acquire righteousness. I'm just going to believe God. I'm just going to profess my faith, and I'm just going to pray, and whatever happens in my life happens. Whatever I do, I do. You can get out of balance both ways. The most thorough teaching in the Bible that really lets us understand how this works is in the book of James. And so I want to read a significant amount of this chapter of James chapter 2. James said, "What does it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him?" Well, pause right there. I mean, didn't the Apostle Paul say that salvation is of faith? So doesn't that mean, yes, faith can save him? But the tone of this question makes me think James is not implying a rhetorical answer of yes, right? It's pretty clear that this question, that the right answer James is saying is obvious, is no. Now, it doesn't mean that faith can't save you at all, but it means just faith all alone in terms of just like a profession, in terms of just saying, oh, mentally, yeah, I believe, and just that's as far as it goes. That alone, if it stops with just saying I've got faith, James is implying that cannot save you. And he's saying, if you have faith but don't have works, where's the profit in that? Is there salvation in that? And then he gives an example here in verse 15. He says, if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding you give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? So he's basically saying words are hollow. And if you just say, oh, I feel so for you, I've got such sympathy and compassion on your situation. I know that you're out in the weather and I know you're hungry. So you know what? My best wishes to you. just, hey, feel better, get warm and get filled, enjoy a meal. God bless you. That doesn't do anybody any good. You could be as genuine and kind seeming and sincere in your intentions, but they're still going to be cold and they're still going to be hungry. You have to actually do something to go with that. And let me ask you this. If obviously this is silly, right? It's kind of ridiculous, but just consider it, contemplate it for a minute. Imagine a person doing that and just saying, wow, I wish you well, patting that hand, patting that shoulder. I wish you well. Be warmed and filled, and just walks off and says, I just want you to know, I really feel for your struggle. I just want you to know that I really, really have compassion on you. Okay, so here's my question. Does that person actually have compassion? Is that compassion? Just to feel it and just to express it, but not to do anything to alleviate the problem? Is that actually compassion? No. Compassion would result in doing whatever you can do to help a situation, right? Well, that's the parallel James is trying to give us here about faith. In verse 17, he says, even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. So a profession of faith, a feeling of faith, a supposed mental decision of faith, if that doesn't have works that come as a result, that James, now this is not me, James said that is dead faith. That's dead faith because it's alone. Then he goes on in verse 18, he says, yea, a man may say, thou hast faith and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. How do you see faith? It's intangible, right? Do you just listen to what someone says? No, you watch what they do. Faith, in biblical faith, the faith that God intends for us, the faith that accesses the power of God, the faith that accesses the grace of God and the salvation of God, is more than just a mental decision that ends there. It's more than just a verbal profession that ends there. Verse 19, he says, thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well, which this is a fundamental truth. There's one God. Got to believe that. We've got to believe that. That's a fundamental. Then that's good, he says. You do well to believe that. Wouldn't want you to believe anything else. Wouldn't want you not to believe that. You do well. But you should realize that the devils believe that as well. They know there's only one God. They don't doubt it. And they even tremble at it. But that's not saving faith. Because what did the devils do? Remember, we studied they were angels who rebelled against the authority of God. It's not that they didn't believe that there's a God and even understand that he is one almighty, all powerful. They knew that, they believed it, they understood it, but they didn't submit to it. So there's different levels of believing. There's different levels of faith, different dimensions of it. And when the Bible talks about the faith that we need to have, when the Bible talks about the faith of Abraham, it's not just a feeling inside. It's not just a profession with the mouth. It has to go beyond that. It's a faith that is so progressed. It's a faith that's so committed. It's a faith and belief that's so strong that you will act on it. Verse 20 here said, wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Imagine that you were at the Grand Canyon, and Evel Knievel had his motorcycle, and he had a ramp at a certain part, and he was able to jump the entire Grand Canyon. That may not be possible. I don't know what I'm talking about at all, but just imagine it's a story, okay? And so Evel Knievel, and you watch him do it. He jumps over, and then he turns around, uses the other ramp, jumps all the way back. Like, wow, that's pretty cool. And he says, you know what? I can actually do that with two people on the motorcycle. And I'll show you. I've got a bag that is the weight of a man, and I'm going to strap that to the back of this motorcycle. And he does it. He jumps, clears it, no problem. And he jumps back, clears it, no problem. You go, wow, that's amazing, right? And then he says, do you believe that I could do it with an actual person on the motorcycle? You go, well, yeah, I believe it. I mean, I see right there, you just did it, and you've got that's the weight of a man on the back there. Yeah, I believe you could do it. Okay, so what's the next question? So then he says, all right, you want to get on? Do you believe he can do it? What kind of faith do you have in the fact that he can do that? Now, I'm not encouraging you to get on the back of Evel Knievel's motorcycle, but I am encouraging you to get on the back of God's motorcycle. And what I'm telling you is that if you have faith in God and you believe God, that faith, you need to cultivate that faith up to the point that you'll get on the back of his motorcycle and do what he says do. The faith is not mature, and it's not going to achieve salvation and achieve God's will in your life if you do not act on it. It's a limited faith, and James went so far as to say it's a dead faith, but it can live. It can live. You got to put life into it by putting action to it. And we're learning about how we are the children of Abraham, right? And how we're following the faith of Abraham. So we're looking at James chapter 2 and this teaching right here. And sure enough, James connects the principle that he's trying to convey here to Abraham. And he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Now, we read a moment ago that Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Well, here's something I want you to understand about Abraham. He was not a perfect man. This guy made some mistakes. This guy committed some acts that were not fully moral. So if we're going to judge him by his life record of right and wrong actions, there may be a lot of right actions there, but there's enough wrong actions that he falls short of the glory of God. That's the measuring stick. If you want to measure your righteousness, don't measure it against your husband or your wife. Don't measure it against your neighbor. Don't measure it against your colleague at work. You've got to measure your righteousness against God. Good luck with that. And Abraham's righteousness doesn't even compare in any way to God's. He's got strikes on his record, but he believed, and God counted that faith as righteousness. He covered him because of believing God. God covered Abraham with God's own righteousness, so that when God looked at Abraham, he didn't see the unrighteousness. He didn't see the shortcomings. He didn't see the failures and the faults. He saw a righteous man. His record is not all righteous, but he believed. Well, James is trying to teach us what that means, because James doesn't want us to make the mistake of thinking, okay, well, I've just got to say, yeah, I think there is a God. And yeah, I think he created heaven and earth. So I believe, and there we go. Now I'm righteous. That's going to count for righteousness. James is saying, no, that's not going to be good enough. It's got to go farther than that, because Abraham's faith that got him that righteousness by believing, that faith resulted in works. It resulted in actions. He believed God to the point that he said, okay, I'm going to get on the back of your motorcycle. Even when you ask me to give up the thing in my life that's most precious to me, a thing I know you're the one who gave me, you asked me to give that up, and you're asking me to give it up in a way that is not even fitting with normal way you do things. But I know you spoke to me. I know it's your word. And so I'm going to act on it to my own hurt. I'm going to act on it, even though it's not to my advantage, because that's how much I believe you. You know, we like to believe God's going to bless us and make us rich. We like to believe God's going to bless our relationships and make us happy. We like to believe God's going to give us peace in our lives. And he does like to do all of those things. But there are times that God says, you know what? That's not the way it's going to be for a little bit. You still believe? Abraham, I gave you a son. You believed me then. That was exciting. That was fun. That was joyful. You believed me then. Now I'm asking for him back. Do you still believe? We need to realize that the faith of Abraham is not a small thing. We can't take it lightly. If we want to be children of Abraham, if we want to be believers, it's not a small thing. This is what it took for Abraham to have it said of him that he believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. He had to offer his son to God. And so James wants us to reflect and learn about this. And in verse 22, he says, do you see this? Do you see how that faith wrought with his works? Now, wrought means like made and shaped, right? The faith by the works was taken to another level. And by works, his faith was faith that was made perfect. The word perfect in Bible language specifically connotes maturing and developing to full potential. So he's saying, when it says Abraham believed God and it was given to him as righteousness, attributed to him as righteousness, it's not just saying that he just like, oh yeah, I believe God. Maybe he had to start there, but he had to build that faith, and it had to happen by him applying that faith, acting on that faith, doing the things God said to do. And that increased his faith even more. He had to have enough faith to do it. And then because he did it, it strengthened and grew and developed his faith. His faith became more fully developed and was made perfect by doing the works that he did because he believed enough to do them. So these things are tied together. When the Bible stresses faith over works, you have to keep in mind that those scriptures are written to a Jewish culture that has not had a lively presence of God's Spirit in their church services for centuries. It was a dark time spiritually. And what they had done, though, was clung to the written traditions of the legal traditions. And they looked at each other and compared themselves to each other and exalted people who they believed lived more by the law than other people. That's the culture and the people that are being addressed by these scriptures that say, hey, it's not by the works of the law, but it's by faith. And it's interesting too, if you really look at all of those verses, which are powerful and important verses, but if you look closely at them, almost every time that it talks about, hey, you're justified by faith and not by works, many of those times, it doesn't just say works, it says works of the law. And it would be a mistake for us to go so extreme in one aspect of that concept as to think our behaviors don't matter, our actions don't matter. That's not what the Bible is teaching us. faith must be applied. If I don't have enough faith to get on the back of the motorcycle, then I don't have the faith that saves. And if I will push to act on the faith, that pushing, even if I'm pushing against reservation and what I might call doubt in my own mind, the fact that I'll push to do according to what God said and not allow the part of my mind that says this is not going to work to rule, that's putting faith in God. That's faith, even though I may struggle with unbelief at the same time. That we're complex people. And there was a particular guy, I didn't put the story in here. There was a guy who brought his son to Jesus because he needed a healing and a deliverance. And Jesus said, oh yeah, this can happen if you believe. And the father was so insightful and so genuine and real with Jesus. He said, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. That's powerful, you guys. That has spoken to me so strongly in my life. He said, I do believe. And yes, okay, there's a part of me that's not so sure, but I brought him here. I'm acting on the part that believes. And because I'm acting on the part that believes, and I'm asking you to help me with that other part, that's how I can grow in faith. You see what I'm saying? That's what James is saying. Abraham grew in his faith because he applied and he made his decisions based on the word of the Lord and not based on the part of him that had fear. It's not saying that Abraham didn't have any doubt or didn't have any fear, but he pushed to act on the faith and not on the doubt and the fear. And therefore, through doing that, his faith was matured, developed, and perfected. And that's when, verse 23, the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then how that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. So I wanted to really emphasize an understanding of faith as we look at the character Abraham, because that's the most important thing for us to learn from Abraham. But let's move into just seeing some of the history that goes forward from here. And I'm going to go just skim through the narrative of events that come at this point. And then in future weeks, we'll see what we might want to go back and illuminate from that. And actually, what I'd like you to do while I go through these next periods of time that I'm just going to skim, anything that strikes you saying, oh, wait, I'd like to know more about that, or I don't understand this or whatever, I'm asking you to make a note of it. And so that we will address and cover the things that strike you and that are on your mind and on your heart. So we enter a time, Abraham and then his son Isaac and his son Jacob, they're called the patriarchs. Abraham actually had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, because God had promised him a son, but years went by before that promise was fulfilled. And during that time, he and his wife kind of gave up on believing that God was going to fulfill the promise the way he said he was. And so they decided, you know what, we're going to have to step in here ourselves and make sure that this son is born. And so Sarah, his wife, said, you know, I've got this servant. You just take her, let her be a concubine for you and have a son, and that'll be the son. And that was Ishmael. And that took place. But then God said, no, that's not it. The promise, the covenant is not going to go through Ishmael. It's going to go through Isaac, who you haven't had yet, but you will. And then sure enough, he did have his son Isaac. But then, as we already mentioned, years later, as Isaac is growing up, God appears to Abraham and says, you know what? Take him up to an altar and sacrifice him. I know you usually sacrifice lambs and things like that. This time, sacrifice your son to me. And Abraham did it. Well, I mean, what would you do? I don't know what I would do. I really don't. But Abraham was only tested. God did not end up having him follow through with actually taking his son's life, although Abraham was literally in the process of doing it when the angel caught his hand and prevented him, and then showed him a ram, Bible says, caught in the thicket for them to offer in place of Isaac. And it's actually just such a beautiful, beautiful depiction of the Lamb of God, which is Jesus Christ, because Isaac represents me and my due, because the wages of sin is death, and it's appropriate for me to be put to death for my own sins. Isaac was in that place ready to be put to death, and then the angel came and there was a substitute. That ram was given as a substitute for Isaac so that Isaac's life could be spared. And that's what Jesus was for me, a substitute, dying for my sins because he didn't have any sins of his own. And yet he was put to death and became sin. So he was a substitute and a replacement for what was actually what I should have suffered. And one thing that's just really, really cool about the phrasing, if we were to read that whole story, when they're on their way up there and Isaac doesn't really know what the plan is, Isaac asked Abraham, hey, you know what? Seems like we've got everything that we need to offer sacrifice except for the animal. And what's up here? You wonder if he's starting to think, are you bringing me up to sacrifice me? What's going on? I don't know if he was thinking that or not, but he asked, where's the lamb? And Abraham's answer, I just think this is just neat, just so cool the way the words come out. When you read it, he says, God will provide himself a lamb. Now, I understand that really what he's saying at that moment is God's going to take care of this by himself. Doesn't need me to help him get the lamb. But it also just sounds so cool the way those words come together. You could take it as saying God's going to provide himself as the lamb. God's going to provide himself a lamb. And that's literally what he did. Jesus was God manifest in the flesh. And so that substitute sacrifice that substituted in my place was not just God taking something out of the flock and putting it on the cross. It was God taking on flesh himself personally and letting himself be put on the cross. God provided himself a lamb for me. Okay, moving on. I said I was going to go fast. So then Isaac also had two sons, Esau and Jacob. They were twins. And Esau, though, came out first and was supposed to receive the birthright. But God just had other plans. And God likes to use these stories just to show us that he doesn't do things the way we expect him to. And he doesn't do things based on the way we see things in terms of who ought to be, blessed or whatever. And so Jacob, with the help of his mother, literally tricked their elderly father into blessing Jacob and instead of Esau. And Jacob made a kind of a con artist deal with his brother to where his brother gave him his birthright just because he was hungry. Now, this is kind of where Esau's head was at. He didn't have an appreciation for what was coming to him. And he was hungry one day, having been out hunting or whatever. And Jacob said, well, I've got some stew I made. You want some? It's like, yeah, I want some. He said, okay, sure. Just give me your birthright. That's all. And Esau actually did it. Can you believe that? Jacob knew how to pull his strings and knew how to play him. And that's exactly what he did. So Jacob replaced Esau as the primary heir to Isaac. But all of that was what God intended to happen. And then Esau became a father of a nation called Edom, which Edom is another kind of like an interchangeable name for Esau, almost like John and Jack. Has a slightly different meaning, but they're both based on the meaning of red earth, because Esau was uh, was was red colored hair and so forth, and very rustic, earthy guy. So when you read in the Bible about the Edomites, these are the descendants of Esau. So they're actually very closely related to the Israelites, because Esau was Jacob's brother. Jacob, meanwhile, when their father, Jacob was afraid for his life. And so Jacob left and went to where their mother was from. And he had a dream in which God indicated to Jacob that he was going to bless him. And Jacob responded and said, okay, we'll see how it goes, basically. But sure enough, that did happen. And years later, coming back in about the same place on his way back home, he had a confrontation with an angel. And this time, he didn't just say, okay, whatever, we'll see what happens. This time, he understood his need for God. This time, he had faith that had grown through his experiences and that resulted in him exerting his own actions and effort. And he wrestled that angel and said, I am not giving up. I need a blessing right now because I'm afraid of what I'm about to face. And I am not giving up until I know that it's taken care of. I'm not going to let you go, angel, until you proclaim a blessing over me and let me know that this has been heard. And so he did that. He also touched his hip and knocked it out of joint so that Jacob walked with a limp the rest of his life. So the touch of God that had happened to him changed him in a way that people saw. Kind of interesting. He walked with a limp from there on out. And the angel said, okay, you're not going to be called Jacob anymore. Jacob means basically con man, supplanter, or cheater or liar. All of that stuff is implied in the name Jacob. He said, you're not going to be called that anymore. You're going to be called Israel. And generally, when you see El in a name, it's a reference to God. El by itself is one of God's names. Israel means you're a prince with God and you have power with God. And so you're going to be called Israel from now on. Because why? Well, let's see. How do you gain access to God? Through faith, right? Believing? Absolutely. But it's a believing that Jacob applied to such an extreme that he pushed with every ounce of his physical strength to wrestle with this angel because he knew that's where my hope is. You see what I mean? That's faith. That's believing. Like, I can't let this angel go. I've got to do whatever it takes because that's my hope. That's my salvation. I won't make it without this. That's what I believe. I believe that I need the touch of God so bad that I will exert myself to get it. And he wrestled that angel, and that gained him the name Israel, saying that's how you have power with God, is to apply faith to wrestle and do whatever is necessary to get through to your blessing. So we have Abraham. The promise did not go to Ishmael. It went to Isaac. And then the promise did not go to Esau. It went to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And then Israel had 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph. And then we're going to show here Joseph's two sons, because when it comes to the tribes of Israel, there's not one tribe of Joseph. Instead, there are two tribes based on his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then the 12th son was named Benjamin. So Israel had 12 sons. So all of a sudden, the Abraham family has big families. Abraham went till he was super, super old before he had any children at all. And then his son had 2. And then that his grandson here's got 12 sons, huge family. And again, let me just race through this, and then we'll see. You guys tell me what aspects you might want to go back and look at more thoroughly. So Joseph had a dream telling him a little about the future, and it involved his brothers bowing down to him. And they already didn't like him because he was daddy's pet. And where they tried to kind of do like most people try to do and take care of the responsibilities, but also get away with whatever they could get away with, Joseph had a bad habit, they figured, of telling on them and telling dad what they were doing. And so they got so mad at him over one incident that they were going to get in trouble for, that they sold him into slavery and told dad he died. Good family. This is Bible people, you guys. Sometimes we think, oh man, those Bible people, they're holy. They walk around just thinking of God stuff all the time. No, they're people, and they had problems in their families just like people today have. So they sold him into slavery. From the place where he was a slave, he rose to authority in that household, but then he got accused of something he didn't do, got thrown into prison for it. While he was in prison, he rose to authority there because he's got the hand of God on his life. And no matter what situation he's in, God elevates him and God blesses him. Sometimes we get too focused on what situation we're in and not realizing all I need to focus on is where's my faith at? And it may take some action to get my faith where it needs to be. But I've got to be focused on my faith, got to be focused on my connection to God, on the Spirit of God, because God will bless me no matter what situation I'm in, slavery, prison, whatever. And while in prison, he had occasion to interpret a couple of dreams because he had this walk with God where God could speak to him. And he shared what God showed him about some dreams, including a dream dreamed by the Pharaoh, the king of the entire country where he was in Egypt. And because of that, the Pharaoh elevated Joseph to the highest level of authority in the entire kingdom, and brought later, years later, that resulted in the reunion between him and his brothers, and he forgave them for what they had done. Because although it was obviously a terrible, horrible thing, all of it was actually orchestrated by God to bring about the will of God. And Joseph chose to see it that way. And Joseph chose to say, you know what? I know that you were doing me wrong, but that's all right. It doesn't matter because I'm really not in your hands. And so, I'm just concerned about how God sees me and you both. I'm not going to hold it against you. What a great attitude. What a great example. If we could look at things that way and say, yeah, this person definitely did do me wrong, but that doesn't stop God from blessing me. And who knows, maybe it's even part of what God has chosen to do in order to bless me. So let me just get past it. And let me just focus on my walk with God. I'm going to love this person anyway. I'm going to forgive them anyway. And sometimes that's really, really hard, you guys. But that's something to seek God over. Releasing people, forgiving people, because you release the power of God in your life and you release yourself from the clenches of bitterness that hold you back when you do that. Well, ultimately, the rest of the family, Israel and the 12 sons and all of their families, moved to Egypt under the blessing of Joseph because he was in such high authority there. But they stayed separated from the Egyptians. They didn't mix with the Egyptians. And over time, those families, over 400 years, those families multiplied and really became a little nation. And the Egyptians felt threatened by the obviously blessed people and brought them into slavery and had them serve. And so that's where we're going to leave off, that God selected Abraham to pull him out from the rest of the world, gave him a covenant and promises, said, I'm going to use you to show the world who I am. and you're going to be the father of nations. And then a few generations later, sure enough, there's this nation that's under covenant with God because of the covenant that Abraham made that was established through works that came built on faith and belief. And even though this is God's nation, covenant nation, they're in slavery. And we're going to leave off right there. And next week, we'll either take up from there and tell about what happened with the nation of Israel in that Egyptian nation from slavery, or we'll go back and illuminate some of the things that we went through quickly, especially if you ask for it.
Good stuff, Brother Christian. You're muted for some reason.
Yeah, because I'm giving you the floor.
All righty. I don't know if you want to keep the recording or not, but we're going to try to bounce around here for just a minute. And guys,